The period we're looking at when we look at American expansion beyond the continent is at the end of the Gilded Age. So the Gilded Age runs from 1865, the end of the Civil War, to about 1900. So the expansion that we're going to be looking at really is in the 1890s, and even more important, in 1898 with the Spanish-American War. The question is, why is America all of a sudden sort of moving away from its isolationism, from sort of looking inward? And first is, it says, you know what, we dealt well, relatively well, with subjugating the Native Americans, so we have that experience should we have to deal with other natives. In addition, way back in 1890, you had Frederick Jackson Turner and his Turner thesis, or frontier thesis, which effectively said that the West had been closed. This is not true, but the impact that it had on Americans was, oh my God, there is no more West for us to sort of move to exploit, so we need to head elsewhere for natural resources. At the same time, you have to remember that the Gilded Age was very brutal for the country. Despite the fact that the war was over in 1865, there were plenty of other wars, in quotes, that were going on, including the Native American Wars, which ran from 1864 to 1900, including much of the racial issues that were going on during Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877, and then Jim Crow South emerging in 1877. In addition, you have the populists rising up, demanding better treatment from the man in terms of railroad prices, and then, of course, the free silver movement. Then you've got all the labor uprisings that are going on as first the Knights of Labor emerge and then die as a result of Haymarket, but then the AFL coming up and demanding better treatment for workers. So from Haymarket and Homestead and Pullman, you have those kind of issues going on, and sort of in the classic Teddy Roosevelt thinking, well, if things are going poor, what can bring us together better than going to fight someone else? Now, during the Gilded Age, the United States was industrializing at a pretty rapid pace and catching up with other European countries. So as it caught up with other European countries in terms of industrialization, it started to think of itself much more as a player on the world stage who should be doing what everyone else is doing, particularly in terms of getting markets in Asia, especially China, which was something that the United States had looked at for a considerable amount of time, particularly as the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, but couldn't really do much about until it had caught up industrially. Now, when you think about trade, your goal always, when you become an industrial nation, is to export far more than you import. And so as trade is increasing with foreign countries, the United States is saying, you know what, the only way that we can really do this is to think of ourselves potentially as an empire, somebody who has colonies for raw materials, somebody who has, through colonies, got sort of a consistent market. And then, of course, we're going to look to have a jumping off point to China itself. On top of this, you have social factors going on. If you're going to think about the social Darwinism that had emerged during this time, mostly relative to how these very rich Americans looked at themselves compared to the poor and said, boy, these are certainly inferior folk, and it's the natural order that we should be great and they should be lowly. But at the same time, there were people like Andrew Carnegie who looked at their status and said, you know what, because I'm wealthy, because I'm successful, I can help other people. Now, didn't really ask how they wanted to be helped, but I have a duty to help other people. Well, there is that sort of theory of social Darwinism as you have people looking out to help others, to bring up these uncivilized savages, because America knows best, going back to these ideas of American exceptionalism, which really becomes, evolves into this idea of the white man's burden. And the white man's burden is because we are Christian, because we are educated, because we have democracy, we can help those people who are quote-unquote backwards. Now, you also have the influence of people like Alfred Thayer Mahan, who are really pushing this idea that your sea strength, your naval strength, is going to help increase both your economic strength and your sort of world power. And so he's putting out ideas that are in some ways very Hamiltonian, like you need a strong domestic economy, which of course the United States had moved to. You need foreign commerce, which the United States was moving to and wanted to do even more. A strong merchant marine, that means ships that can transport your goods around the world. The United States didn't necessarily have that as of yet. They didn't have a very strong navy to defend these routes, but he's encouraging them to have one. And again, he's pushing this idea, going all the way back to your ideas of empire and mercantilism from the 1600s, that you need to have colonies that are going to provide raw materials and markets for you. Now, Mahan is also going to push this idea of a canal that he's advocating should be in Central America, so you don't have to go around Tierra del Fuego. Now, these ideas, much like Henry Clay's American system, are not all put in place at one time, but they are put in place over time. When you think about America's first expansion, it actually is Hawaii. Now, Hawaii is not terribly important in the whole grand scheme of the expansion narrative. It's just important to understand why it happened and how it sort of set the tone for everything else. Now, Americans had been in Hawaii really since the early 1800s, had used it first as a coaling station in terms of its strategic location for ships going westward. At the same time, missionaries had gotten in there and were spreading Christianity. But the big deal was sugar growers. And so sugar growing is very important for the Hawaiian economy, and you get Americans over there who are becoming sugar barons. Now, the sugar barons seize a bunch of power in Hawaii, and the Hawaiians don't like it, and so they put Queen Liliuokalani, a powerful nationalist, on the throne. She's only there for about 2 years, and it's important. Her overthrow is certainly a bit shady. But the reason that the American sugar growers want to overthrow Queen Liliuokalani and put themselves in power and ask to be annexed by the United States is there was a McKinley tariff that came through. Now, don't confuse this because William McKinley is not yet president when this gets passed. He's a congressman. But the importance of this is that the Hawaiians no longer have a favorable way to trade sugar in the United States. Because of this tariff, it's as if it's coming in from another country, so it has to come in over a price wall like all tariffs do. So these sugar barons stage a revolution. They overthrow the queen. They ask for United States help, and basically there is some help by the Americans, or at least some protection should something go bad. And at the end of the day, a government is created by these Americans who make up a very small portion of the Hawaiian population. The president at the time, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat, says, you know what, you can't be annexed because what happened looks pretty shady and pretty illegitimate. And it appears that the Hawaiians don't want to be annexed. So Hawaii is not annexed, and that's important to understand. We don't just get Hawaii immediately. Now, we will sort of take it incidentally once we're starting to deal with the Far East, with the Philippines. But it's important to realize that at first, even though it looks like the United States would snatch it right up, it did not. Now we're going to shift from way out in the Pacific with Hawaii to Cuba. Now Cuba is obviously very close and has sort of a long piece in United States history narrative going all the way back to Columbus. Now the Spanish Empire is really crumbling, or I don't know if you can say crumbled, by the late 1800s. And the Cubans, who have risen up numerous times, are going to rise up again. And there's plenty of brutality both on the side of the Cubans and the Spanish. But the story that really gets told in the United States by the yellow journalists Pulitzer and Hearst is just how absolutely awful the Spanish are being to the Cubans, showing pictures of what's going on in the Spanish reconcentration camps where they've actually put the good guys, so, quote unquote, so they can figure out who the bad guys are. Now, on top of this yellow journalism, which is really just designed to hopefully start a war and sell a war to sell newspapers, you have the De Lome letter, which is a Spanish ambassador who criticizes McKinley as weak and how dare you criticize our president overall. But all of this sort of pales in comparison to what happens with the Maine, the ship in the Havana Harbor, which blows up, and of course it's the Spanish, or so we thought, even though there was no data at the time to specifically say that it was the Spanish. But all of this led up to the United States declaring war on Spain over Cuba, or specifically over this ship exploding. Now, this war against Spain starts over Cuba, but it's going to spread really globally, and it's not going to be a war really of any great importance in terms of fighting. It's only 4 months long. The United States does struggle, as it always does in war, but still only takes 4 months. And in the end, sort of fewer than 500 Americans are killed in war. You have about 5,000 who die of disease, which is not surprising since the United States was not really well prepared to fight in these sort of tropical climates. But the important piece that we want to make sure to figure out is, how do we get to the Philippines? Well, because the Philippines was part of the Spanish Empire, Teddy Roosevelt, the Undersecretary of the Navy, is thinking, hey, I'm a Mahan guy. I'd love to get ourselves closer to China. Philippines looks weak because the Spanish are weak. Let's take advantage of that. So you have George Dewey, who goes to Manila, quickly takes Manila, but then he needs to figure out how he's going to actually take the mainland. And with the help of Filipino nationalist Emilio Algonado, who's brought back from exile, it is possible for the U.S. to finally take the Philippines. So really, once the Spanish are defeated, again, in fewer than 4 months, negotiations are going to begin in Paris for the Third Treaty of Paris, not to be confused with 1763 or 1783. And the question is sort of, what are we going to do? Should we build an empire or not? And since the United States is going to get from Spain, it's going to get Puerto Rico, it's going to get Cuba, which it told the world in the Teller Amendment that it will not keep. It's going to get Guam, and it's going to really get the right to keep the Philippines if it wants for $20 million for all of that land. And the question really becomes the Philippines. Okay, Puerto Rico is going to stay, Guam's going to stay, Cuba with the Platt Amendment is going to get freedom in quotes, namely that it sort of can't make deals with foreign nations and can't go into debt, or else the United States will intervene. And lastly, it's going to have to allow for a coaling station / naval base on Cuba. But all of this pales in comparison to the debate over should we build an empire, and by that, an empire far, far away, including the Philippines. And there are those people who say, you know what, an empire is really good for the country because you're going to find yourself often as an empire having to deal with foreign nations, perhaps even at war, and people like Teddy Roosevelt said that's good for the health of the country. And then you have other people who are speaking purely economically, say we've got to get our foot in the door in Asia. If we can't get to China like all the other European countries, or many European countries like Britain and France and Russia and even Japan, we should at least get close, okay? And then there are those Republicans who say, well, this was our war. This seems like the spoils of war. This is great if we build an empire. We look great as a result. And then you've got this argument that says, well, the Philippines is already ours. We've got it. And now if we give it up, make it free, then other countries could swoop in and get it, because we know, according to the logic of sort of white man's burden, that the Filipinos are unfit for self-government. But there are people in the U.S. Senate who say, absolutely not. This is not the route that we should be taking. It's immoral. Do we not remember 1776 and the lead-up, where we, as revolutionaries, fought against oppression? We're simply becoming the British all over again. There's people who take a very different tact and say, well, we don't want more Asians coming into the country. Remember the legacy of 1882, Chinese Exclusion Act, renewed again in 1892, so sort of anti-Asian pollution, quote unquote, of the American population. There are those workers in America who say, absolutely, we do not want cheap laborers coming in from the Philippines to compete with us. Remember, this is an era where American laborers are very concerned with South and Central Europeans coming in and working for cheap. There are others who say, let's think about Jefferson. Jefferson said we don't want a standing army, and it would require a standing army to defend if we have an empire. And if we have a standing army and the standing army doesn't have anything to do, they could certainly be used against the people. You've got other sugar growers in America. Now, actually, Hawaii, it's been taken as part of America and annexed, and they don't want even more competition from sugar growers. So this all coalesces in what's known as the Anti-Imperialist League, which fights against taking the Philippines. But at the end of the day, William McKinley preys on it and says, you know what, it is our duty to take in these Philippines and educate them and uplift and Christianize them, which is ironic because they were already Catholic. But he really sees this as an opportunity to give self-government to those people who need it, which is interesting because we're going to impose our government on them in order to give them self-government, which really doesn't make all that much sense overall.